All right, we might kick off. So, hi everyone. Thank you for your attendance today at the first of two sessions that we're going to have talking about mental health and wellness at work. So for those of you joining us today on the agenda, we'll be having a chat about mental health in the workplace. First, we're going to briefly go through the latest findings from our Employment Hero Wellness at Work survey for 2022. We're then going to hear from our expert speaker, Kellie Lewis. And finally, if we do have some time, we'll do some Q&As. So if you do have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your webinar screen. If we don't have a chance to get to them today, then we'll take them away and send them out post-webinar. But first, a quick disclaimer, as always, the information in this the information in this webinar is relevant as at today and is general advice only. So please take a second just to have a read of this disclaimer. If there's anything that you do need assistance with for individual advice, we do recommend that you consult an expert for your individual situations. So that is our disclaimer today. So again, on the agenda, we're going to look at our latest wellness findings. We're going to talk about mental health and hear from Kellie Lewis. So let me welcome Kellie first today and thank her for joining us. Kellie is a registered psychologist and the co-founder and managing director of the Mental Health Project and a prominent mental health and wellbeing expert. Kellie has over 30 years experience in the mental health space and has led countless leaders and teams in creating positive impacts through building mental health knowledge and skills in the workplace. So thank you so much for joining us and welcome, Kellie.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Nice to meet everyone. Look forward to talking with you all soon.
We're very excited to hear from you today, so thank you very much. So before we jump into Kellie's presentation, I wanted to briefly take everyone through some of the findings that Employment Hero found as part of our Wellness at Work findings for our 2022 survey, which we actually released last week. I'm sure that we're all very cognizant of the impact that the last few years have had on everybody. What our survey has actually found is that those impacts to mental health and wellbeing are still being felt widely and deeply amongst all of our people, making today's conversation just as important, if not more so, than those that we've had over the past 2 years. So we actually surveyed over 1,000 employees in Australian businesses, and we found that many are still struggling with burnout and mental health and wellbeing. As you can see here, we found that over half of Australian employees are struggling with burnout at work, with 53% having felt burnout and fatigue in the last 3 months. Even though respondents are saying that and indicated that they are burnt out, the good news is that they do feel like they're doing meaningful work, with 69% agreeing that they feel like that their work is meaningful to them, which is fantastic. So it means it's not all bleak. Next slide, please, Jules. It means it's not all bleak. 72% of respondents said that they felt their workplaces accepted them for who they are as a person. And this is great news for all of our efforts in diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and is a massive influence on the overall well-being and happiness of our employees. So that's a really great outcome to see for everybody. But we are still seeing many effects from the pandemic, with people rethinking their careers and the importance of their careers. 35% have indicated that COVID has decreased the importance they place on their careers. So it's really important for us as HR professionals to think about that, particularly in the context of the Great Resignation and ensuring we're building great workplaces that focus on wellbeing for our people. Another of the key takeaways from this survey is that it pays for us to focus on wellbeing and wellness. 63% of respondents said that they were more likely to be loyal to their company due to their commitment to wellness, which is a massive percentage of people responding in this manner. And finally, another finding, which may be unsurprising to everybody given the current cost of living impacts we're all feeling at the moment, 56% of workers said they were stressed about money and their finances, with females slightly more likely to be stressed about their finances. So I think that's some really important key takeaways out of our survey for this year, and links really beautifully into why we're having this conversation today. So these insights tell us it is still important for us as HR professionals and business leaders to continue to focus on mental health and wellbeing, because the effects of the last 2 years are still being widely felt. If you want more information on our findings, you can find a copy of our Wellness to Work report on our website. So please check it out and download it. But for now, I would love to hand over to Kellie Lewis to talk all things to you that you need to know about mental health at work. So over to you, Kellie.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I will just set up with sharing my screen. If you'll just give me one moment, everybody. Can you see the new screen, Lauren?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. So many people, as we know, across the community are experiencing, as we can see from the Employment Hero results, a mental health condition at some point in their lifetime. And unfortunately, what we know is that mental health issues are still often quite feared, often misunderstood, and certainly quite challenging for professionals to deal with in the workplace. However, I know that through learning more about it, professionals then can help reduce the stigma in the workplace and help support people in really helpful and constructive ways in how to work with mental health in their workplace. What this means is that when you've increased your knowledge, increased your awareness, what we're able to do as professionals in the workplace is that we've got a more accurate and helpful knowledge and understanding about, therefore, how to manage it properly. So often when we do, just as a quick note, do talk about mental health issues, it can bring up concerns for people. And if that is something that you need further support with, there is a lot of support out there in the community. And one of that is being Lifeline on 13 11 14. So I do encourage you to reach out should you need any support, or anybody within your personal or professional network needs that support. So what we're going to talk about over the 2 sessions, not necessarily all today, is we're going to look at understanding mental health conditions, demystifying 3 specific mental health conditions, which are those what you'll experience most frequently in the workplace, looking at how we manage mental health conditions from both a legal and compliance perspective, as well as an ethical perspective, and what the different roles and responsibilities of the organisation, the manager, and an individual is in managing mental health conditions. And this will include some brief information as well on a pretty tricky topic, which is managing performance concerns when there's a mental health issue involved as well, which we find is quite a common challenge with people knowing how to deal with this. And then we'll also talk about discussing mental health conditions, which is how do you have an effective conversation with someone about mental health and deal with difficult situations that might arise when you are having those challenging conversations. So hopefully that is well and truly what you've logged on to listen to, and we'll make it nice and interesting and relevant for you guys. So if we then first turn to understanding mental health conditions, what it's really helpful to understand is what actually mental health is, and the way that we actually conceptualize mental health is really under a continuum, because there's a lot of information in the popular media about mental illness, and it can often be quite confusing, and people aren't sure, well, mental illness versus a mental health condition versus somebody having a diagnosed condition versus going through a little bit of a rough patch. So the way that we help workplaces understand mental health is that it can be helpful to think about it in terms of a continuum. So what we actually then look at is, as a starting point, mental health and what that actually looks like. So when we're talking about an individual who's mentally healthy in the workplace, what we're looking at is a person's sense of good physical, psychological, and social health and well-being. So we typically say that someone's mentally healthy if they are functioning in their world, that they're realising their highest potential, and that they're able to form really positive relationships and function constructively in their community. And also that they have challenges in life and they might have a whole range of emotions and experiences related to these challenges, which is completely normal in terms of being mentally healthy, but they're able to cope with it in more or less largely positive and constructive ways. Not all the time. You're still mentally healthy. If you need to go home on a Friday night and have a glass of wine, that's all okay. But on the most part, are you dealing with things in a healthy and constructive way? And when you are feeling challenged by some of life stresses, are you able to reach out to friends and have a conversation, go and do some exercise, go to the movies, all those things that make you feel good, talk to someone to be able to work through those issues. So it's important to stress that being mentally healthy does not mean that you don't experience rough patches, and it doesn't mean that all of your employees obviously coming into the workplace are going to be 100% on top of their game all the time. We know in reality that we experience rough patches, but on the most part, therefore, if that's the definition, we're coping with life's challenges in a relatively positive and constructive fashion. Then on the other side of the continuum, we've got mental illness. And this is the general term used for a group of illnesses, which we term in psychology as significantly and persistently affecting how a person thinks, feels, and behaves. So it's these patterns of thoughts and feelings and behaviours which are more often than not having a negative impact on a person's overall emotional, psychological, physical health and well-being, their overall happiness, and also their overall capacity to function day to day. So depression and anxiety are examples of this type of diagnosable mental illness. So what I really encourage is people to think of mental illness like any other health issue, such as diabetes or heart disease or having a bad back, in that it's real and it's treatable. It has both physical symptoms, such as being tired or having a headache, and also will have psychological symptoms, such as feeling down or worried, for example. And it's these sorts of feelings that are, just to reiterate, that are persistent and are having a dysfunctional, destructive impact on your life over a long period of time. Again, to reiterate, this is not your normal way of just dealing with life's challenges and having the whole range of normal human emotions. So then we think about, well, what do we mean when people say, I've got a mental health problem? Or what we talk about here is often people will use this term when they're having difficulties with their thoughts and feelings, and it's having a negative impact on their ability to function at their best, but it's not really at the degree of a diagnosable mental health issue. Because in psychology, for those who are on the call and have any kind of psychological, psychiatric or clinical background, you'll know that there is a particular criteria that needs to be met to diagnose a mental illness. And someone might not meet that criteria, but they are very well and truly struggling with their mental health. And so it still may be that they're experiencing these issues, but what we see is they tend to recover more quickly and they get to their regular level of functioning to what they'd expect. Sometimes when someone first experiences a mental health problem, they may go on to develop a temporary or more longer term chronic mental illness, and then it will become more of a mental illness and we're diagnosing it, which is the criteria that we tend to use professionally. So we do need to be mindful in the workplace and the community that we're not labelling everything a mental illness or assuming someone's change in behaviour means that they've got a mental health issue or a diagnosable mental illness. They might just be having a moment of working through their challenges. So then we look at mental health condition. So this is the generic term that we often use to describe someone who's experiencing both an illness or a problem with their mental health. And mental health condition is typically at the Mental Health Project and all of the learning packages that we do online with our e-learning programs. That's the term we'll typically use, because the strategies that you use ostensibly, it doesn't really matter if you're diagnosed with a mental health issue or you're struggling just generally with your mental health and it's not diagnosable, you're still going to need to seek assistance. And we refer to this as having a mental health condition, and that's what we're working with. There's also the term having a rough patch that often, quite often in the Australian vernacular that we'll use. And so, again, this is more considered just a normal course of being a human being, that we have rough patches and we're dealing with things in constructive, healthy ways, although we might be feeling down or unhappy or not quite ourselves. And usually when we're having a rough patch, again, the signs and symptoms aren't so much to the degree of a mental illness or a mental health problem. They're just, as we say, just having a bit of a rough patch. But often in the workplace, if someone's having a rough patch, you might notice it, and it might be cause to have that conversation with them and apply support. I will share the video that we have here regarding incidents of mental health conditions in the workplace. It's important, I think, in the workplace to understand the prevalence of mental health, which is obviously why we're all here today, because, and with Employment Hero's recent insights, that we do know that mental health issues in the workplace are a very real thing. So I think it's quite interesting to understand some of the facts and figures around that. So I'm going to look to play this. Is that coming through, Lauren?
Yes, it is. Hi guys, I think we're just having some trouble with the audio, but the video is still working. So some really important facts and figures coming through. Thanks for sharing that you can't hear it.
All right. Apologies, I could hear it. I do not know why the audio was not coming through for the group, so my apologies. But as Lauren said, there was some you could see all of the content was on the animation anyway. So as we can see, that there is a very high prevalence of mental health conditions that we will experience in the workplace. So let's have a look now at some of the myths that are out there regarding mental health conditions, because often in the workplace or within our lives we'll be experiencing experiencing mental health conditions with our team, and there's a lot of, as I'd said before, misinformation regarding that. So let's just have a look at a couple of the common ones. Is individuals with mental health conditions just need to learn better coping skills. Mental health is not just about learning better coping skills. Someone doesn't experience a mental health issue because they've got a deficit in their capacity to deal with their challenges in life necessarily. It is a complex set of circumstances where someone may not be able to cope with their mental health concerns. So having said that though, learning coping skills and implementing other psychological and lifestyle strategy does usually form, and we know the evidence tells us, is an effective approach to managing mental health in an individual. And in fact, developing coping skills from a cognitive behavioural perspective is one of the most effective measures that we have, and it may be that someone just needs to develop those coping skills, which can often be a very helpful intervention in the workplace and helpful education to provide in the workplace around, you know, it might be helping people build resilience, their psychological resilience, for example, so they're able to cope better with setback and challenges in life. Depression. So not even sure if that's a real thing. Don't people just need to pull themselves together and get over it? An interesting story with this one is you may experience in your own lives, but about 18 months ago, I was talking with a gentleman whose son was recently diagnosed with depression, and there was very much a frame around, well, can't people just get on with it? They just need to pull themselves together. What's this depression thing anyway? And that was just 18 months ago, and we're in sort of 2022, and a lot of those attitudes do, just through lack of knowledge and understanding, don't necessarily understand that depression is a real thing, and it's not just about pulling yourself together. It is a medically recognised and diagnosable illness, and it is actually caused by changes in brain chemistry. So it's more than just, as I had said before, around having a rough patch or perhaps experiencing a mental health condition, is that it's more than just feeling down. It's actually having severe, mild to severe psychological and physical symptoms that actually can cause slight to debilitating dysfunction. And unfortunately, when we have dismissive views towards whether it's depression or anxiety, it does help perpetuate that stigma, unfortunately, for people who maybe are experiencing it silently or have the courage sometimes to talk about it with their workplace. Another one is that the right support and treatment can help people with mental health conditions lead fulfilling lives. And actually, as per the facts and figures video, that we know that with the right support and treatment, and when people do actually reach out for help, that it can make a really significant positive difference to full recovery or ongoing, more helpful management of their mental health condition. And this, we know from the research, is particularly so if a person receives help early. And so again, having systems and processes and a culture in place in the workplace where it's safe to seek help, safe to disclose to the appropriate people that you may be experiencing a mental health condition, because then you can be supported through all of the great things that workplaces have in place, such as EAP or internal mental health first aid officers, or all of the education programs that organisations have available now, that you can link somebody into that help early. And we know the research says that that can help very much in the long-term chronic management of mental health issues. Then we've got that people with a mental health condition are violent. This is quite an interesting one because it does come often, sometimes mental health conditions and mental health illness can come with behaviour that makes people feel uncomfortable. And sometimes, and I'll talk about this later today or in part 2, that if behaviours are sometimes with substance abuse, if perhaps they're erratic or become aggressive, is that there can be a fear that people with mental health condition are violent, and so then that impacts the way that we then work with people on that. Actually, what the research tells us is that it's people living with a mental health condition are actually no more violent or dangerous than any rest of the population or subpopulation. And in fact, we also know that people living with a mental health condition are more likely to be victims of violence or self-harm than actually to hurt anybody else, which I think is important for us to reflect on when we're working with someone who has a mental health issue. Mental health conditions are a result of personal weakness. So what we know is that mental health conditions are actually caused by genetic, environmental, biological and social determinants, and it's a broad range of a combination of one or all of these things that actually are related to causation of mental health issues. Experiencing either an acute, which means sort of episodic, just a short period of time of a mental illness, or having a chronic mental health condition is not the result of somebody's individual character flaw, and encouraging people to have a frame themselves around that, as well as the frames that we have around people in the workplace when we're working with people with a mental health condition, is a more helpful frame to have. All mental health conditions are essentially the same. So, and I will do a deeper dive on 3 mental health conditions in due course, but what we know is that there's many types of mental health conditions, and within that, it's not an exact science because everyone experiences, let's say it's depression or anxiety, quite differently. So, we know that particular mental health issues are clearly defined by a certain set of symptom profiles, and that, as I had said, that people who have the same mental health conditions, such as anxiety, might actually present with a really unique set of the causation related to that, the symptoms that they experience, as well as the treatment that they might be engaged in. And often the treatment can be a result of whether it's an acute or chronic, mild to severe symptoms, and personal choice about how you want to manage your mental health condition. And we also know that there's the combination of mental health conditions as a combination of psychological, which are your thoughts and your feelings, as well as physical indicators. And your physical indicators can be with some of your psychological indicators, or they can be completely separate, which is why it often can be quite challenging to diagnose mental health conditions. Lauren, I'll just ask at this point, are there any burning questions that are coming through, or anything that you would like me to address that's coming through as I continue on?
Not at this stage. There's a few questions coming in around how to address this with your people and the way in which we ask and seek information from our people on mental health illnesses in the workplace. But I think we just keep going for the moment. And if we have time at the end, we can ask some more specific questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lauren. And to just address that, and a good reason to come to part 2 is that we'll actually get to that in part 2 in terms of specifically how do you address this, and I'll be providing you with a model which we call our peer conversation model, that you'll be able to learn about specifically and very practically how to engage with someone, and then how to deal with some of those tricky things, like if someone doesn't want to speak to you, or they get upset, I'll be covering in full detail in part 2 all of those things around how to have that conversation. So let's then look at, if we know very broadly what some of the myths around mental health conditions, let's look a little more broadly around how do we actually recognise a mental health condition. So we can sort of very practically get down to, okay, so you're in the workplace and you've got people reporting directly to you, or you're in the people team or the health and safety team. How do you actually recognise if someone's got a mental health condition, particularly if someone is not, which is, we know from the research is more often the case, is you might suspect someone has a mental health condition, but you don't know because they've not disclosed it. And they've not disclosed it for a range of reasons. It may be their personal choice. It may be fear around the impact that it has on their profession, and the impact that it has on them on the workplace. It may be around not knowing the workplace pathways upon which to address it. So there may be a lot of reasons that we need to be mindful of how we actually recognise it without being told that someone has a mental health condition. So if we look broadly at mentally healthy, now these, I always sort of feel somewhat nervous at times bringing these couple of slides up because it's not prescriptive and it's not definitive. It is just really encouraging you to look at the difference between broadly, if you're thinking about the way that somebody or yourself is thinking or feeling and the way that they're acting, versus on the next slide, signs and symptoms that you might see if you're looking more at a mental health condition, whether that be a bit of a rough patch or an actual mental health, a mental illness. And the key point I want to make here over these next two slides is, whilst this is, as I said, not definitive and it's indicative, is to be mindful of changes in an individual's behaviour. That's one of the key things in terms of how you're going to recognise somebody that might need support in your workplace. So with that in mind, what we know, the research tells us, is that someone who is mentally healthy in terms of their thinking patterns, they tend to be more optimistic in nature, more purposeful, more adaptable, and a high level of resilience where they're viewing where they're viewing things that might not be going so well in their life, or things they've made mistakes on, as learning opportunities rather than a failure. They'll tend to feel, even in the face of challenges, they'll tend to feel more confident and self-assured, focused and calm, quite confident and more enthusiastic about things. And you'll tend to notice much more of a stable mood, not mood swings within a day or from week to week. Then, in terms of the behaviours that you might see, because often the thinking and the feeling will more notice through language, the way that someone's approaching something. But in terms of behaviour, that will tend to see a mentally healthy person described, or typically, more often than not, be engaged in their work tasks, being quite proactive in their behaviours. They'll tend to complete the things they need to complete within a day and be able to do that with, to a good degree of quality. They'll be able to respond to changes, a flurry of emails where things didn't quite go so right, or an update, or something's gone different with a project. They'll tend to respond to that in much more of a calm and focused manner. And they'll also adopt and take on board learnings that they'll have from setbacks. Then, as I bring up the next slide in terms of, okay, well, if that's what the research tells us a mentally healthy person sort of generally conducts themselves as, what about then if we look at someone with a mental health condition? The other thing I want to point out here as I bring this slide up is, not only are we looking at changes in a person's behaviour, but also, and often when I do this face-to-face, this sort of gets quite a few smiles or a bit of a laugh and a bit of a nod of a head, but we also need to be mindful that sometimes someone's personality qualities, just the way that they approach things, might be that let's say, for example, here, there might be a high level of errors, or they might be overly self-critical, for example, or defensive to feedback. That just might be personality qualities. And so we need to be mindful that just because someone's a bit cantankerous or a little bit moody or not the most enthusiastic person in the world, obviously it doesn't mean they have a mental health condition. And just because somebody's feeling a little impatient, we don't sort of jump on that with a mental health frame. It just could be their personality. So then when we're thinking about someone with a mental health condition, we then tend to look at people who have poorer concentration, more difficulty in forming their thoughts. They might have repetitive or unhelpful thoughts, which is often the case with depression and anxiety and substance abuse. From a feelings perspective, they may tend to be their tether might be a little bit shorter, so they might tend to be a little bit more frustrated or irritable, might get a bit more anxious, or have kind of feel quite uptight and angry at times, and might have more mood swings. Some of the things you might see behaviour-wise is what the changes are in terms of their capacity to complete work, whether they have trouble, keeping within project expectations. Are they avoiding things such as meetings? Are they quite maybe self-critical? And are you noticing any absenteeism or presenteeism, or them sort of not engaging with their colleagues as much as you'd expect? So that's the general research, I guess, evidence-based way that we look at the difference between a mental health person, a mentally healthy individual versus someone with a mental health condition, very much with the message that the intent is to be mindful of changes in behaviour, and to be aware of some of the particular signs and symptoms of mental health issues, so you can then have that as a trigger to potentially check in and reach out with someone, or direct them to support services within and outside of your organisation. Which then is a really good segue into, okay, so we know generally what a mentally healthy person versus someone with a mental health issue might be experiencing themselves, and what you might see in the workplace. But very specifically, as you would have seen from the facts and figures animation, that you are most likely in the workplace, so yourself or your leaders or your team are most likely to encounter anxiety, depression, and substance abuse in the workplace, because these are the most prevalent mental health conditions. You will, of course, might experience other mental health illnesses. You might experience some more extreme behavioural in the rare circumstance, but this is typically what you're going to see. And interestingly, from Employment Heroes data that they shared before, what we also know is the research from a psychological mental health perspective is when you are feeling engaged at work in doing meaningful work, and that you are feeling supported from a mental health and wellbeing perspective in the workplace, that you are in fact less likely to experience any kind of trigger or any trigger to anxiety and depression, not so much substance abuse, but anxiety and depression. And that the workplace has a really important role to play in respect of creating a mentally healthy environment. So anyone who maybe has a pre-existing mental health issue, that they're operating in a mentally healthy environment where they've got meaningful work, and that their workload is reasonable, and that the organisation and the employees are working on that together. So there's not those unreasonable expectations, creating burnout, which we know from COVID and the research from COVID and working from home, and some of Employment Heroes data that they shared and is on their website. is really, really interesting to look at. And I encourage you guys to take a look at it. So let's have a look, therefore, at anxiety. So anxiety is the most common mental health condition in Australia. And so this is what you're going to experience the most in the workplace. I do have an animation that goes through the signs and symptoms and treatment of anxiety. What I'll do, just because the audio wasn't coming through, what I will do is I will play it and then I'll just ask you, Lauren, if the audio is coming through. I can hear it at my end. I'm not sure from a presenter end whether anything needs to be unmuted. I suspect not, but just to flag that. So I'm going to press play and we'll just see if the audio comes through. If not, I can talk to it, so that's no problem.
No, I think the audio isn't coming through again. Sorry, Kellie.
Okay, no problem. That is no problem. I think rather than me managing the audio, I will just talk to understanding anxiety. So, and whilst I do it, I will just let you guys have a look at the animation because that will be interesting while I talk. Hold on 1 second. Okay. So we all experience anxiety from time to time, and that might be because we've got a high period of stress because we're worried about a presentation or worried about our financial circumstances, and that's very normal. But from time to time, we might develop anxiety, which is beyond just feeling nervous or worried for a period of time. It is much more around feeling anxious over an extended period of time with a very specific set of symptoms. So for a person experiencing anxiety, it can actually be quite debilitating because one of the signs and symptoms of anxiety is that it can be quite consuming and ruminating in your mind, and be debilitating in terms of the activities that you then feel that you can engage in the workplace. So the general signs and symptoms that we're looking at with anxiety is that you feel very worried and anxious most of the time. You're not able to control these feelings of anxiety. These types of thoughts are often trivial to others, and you're constantly worrying and imagining the worst, and you might find it difficult to focus. You might, from a panic attack perspective, feel suddenly overwhelmed or frightened. You'll tend to avoid situations that cause anxiety because it's so debilitating that often avoidance occurs. And you'll have both psychological and physical symptoms, depending on the type of anxiety that you have. So for anxiety to be actually diagnosed, they must have a certain set of signs and symptoms that are debilitating over a 6-month period. There's lots of different types of anxiety. So the typical ones, which are defined by their specific set of signs and symptoms, is generalized anxiety disorder, the phobias, OCD, and panic disorder. So we know, interestingly, that the causes of anxiety come from both a person's personal life as well as genetic factors. And it's a combination of these factors that are actually related. We do know that a stressful life event can be a trigger. We know that experiencing a physical health problem can be a trigger, as can alcohol and drug abuse and specific personality qualities, such as being a perfectionist or having low self-esteem. So most people with anxiety will have a period of anxiety, and recover and lead fulfilling lives with the right set of cognitive behavioural approaches, which is the evidence-based treatment to that. The milder anxiety specifically can be managed by lifestyle changes, but your more moderate to severe anxiety can require intensive counselling and also medication if that's required. And so from a workplace perspective with anxiety, if you do notice someone who might be experiencing some of the signs and symptoms, is the encouragement and the best practice in the workplace is if you've got the appropriate relationship with them, is actually to reach out to them and check that they're okay, and encourage them through your own internal workplace processes and support, again, whether that's through an EAP that you might have or your internal support mechanisms, is to actually encourage them to seek help within the workplace. I might just
Kellie, I might just mention we've got 10 minutes of time left before the hour's up, so I just wanted to flag that with you.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll just in the last 10 minutes follow, we will finish off everyone on our depression overview and our substance abuse overview to come back for part 2, where we'll be covering off on the having an effective conversation and all of the practical tools and tips around, okay, now that we know what it is, how will we have that effective conversation with them and build our skills and knowledge around that. Are there any questions, Lauren, at this point that you need me to address?
No, I think for time, let's go through depression and what it is. It's important information for everybody to hear.
Wonderful, thank you. So depression. We know that 1 in 6 individuals in Australia will experience depression, like diagnosable depression, at some point in their lives. And from a formal diagnosis definition perspective, depression is when experience feelings of depression intensely, sometimes which can be quite the disconcerting feature of depression, and often from a diagnosis perspective helps us determine whether we're diagnosing depression versus working on someone on just adjusting to sort of a set of normal life circumstances, and they've got a normal set of emotions related to their life experience, is that often these feelings of depression are for no obvious reason. And that can be very disconcerting to happen over weeks, months, or years, when you kind of go, well, you might sort of tick off various positive things in your life and go, well, what's wrong with me? Like, why should I feel depressed? Versus there might be a very obvious trigger. And it's an ever-present feeling. It doesn't sort of come and go. And it's most often experienced with a range of physical and psychological symptoms, which can make it difficult to manage day-to-day life. So the types of depression is major depression. We've got antenatal and postnatal depression, bipolar disorder, cyclothymic disorder, dysthymic disorder, and also, some of you may have heard of it, but also seasonal affective disorder. That is actually a diagnosable subset of depression, and it's specifically related to a change in the season, and it's often related to a change in the season to winter, and it is very much a real thing. So I'm not going to go in a huge amount of detail into each of these. Really, the point is that depression isn't just depression. There is a range of diagnosis, and depending on what the type of depression is that you've got will very much depend on the signs and symptoms that will appear, and also the treatment that is provided. So if we look at the signs and symptoms, a person is depressed for 2 or more weeks if they have felt sad, down, or miserable most of the time, has lost interest or pleasure in their typical activities, and experienced several signs and symptoms from at least these 4 categories: the thoughts, the feelings, the behaviours, and also the physical category. Interestingly, with depression, that it's only a 2 or more week diagnosed time frame. And I think from a workplace perspective, when you are dealing or working with someone who says, I have depression, it's important to understand this, because then you can ask really informed questions around, okay, what type, if you don't mind me asking, and ensuring that there's appropriate style of questioning and privacy maintained. But if you're trying to help someone in the workplace in terms of, and I'll get into this in part 2, but adjustments you might make in the workplace to help somebody, understanding the type of depression they have as well as the signs and symptoms that they've got is important. And if we look at the causes, we have a blend of life events, which can be a critical or chronic set of life events, personal factors, as well as having a neurological, so biochemical imbalance. We know from the research that is the cause of depression. And from a treatment perspective, there are 2 evidence-based treatment depressions, and there's only 2. It is the medical treatments and psychological treatments. So this is your your medication that you might be prescribed, and a range of psychological treatment, which includes lifestyle changes, as well as cognitive behavioural therapy. They're the 2 only evidence-based treatments that we have for depression. And to be clear, in terms of that, the lifestyle includes things around exercise and positive relationships in life, the way sleeping, your sleep patterns, your eating patterns, your screen patterns, your social media patterns. That's all new in the space of depression, that we're learning our understanding of that in depression. So when you are in the workplace and working with someone who might be sharing what their treatment is, again, understanding what the evidence-based treatment is and what that might mean for them, their behaviour or support of them in the workplace is important. So our last one is substance abuse, but what I'm going to do is, because we have the luxury of a part 2, I will, and we've got 2 minutes left, I will close at depression, and we'll open up the next session on substance abuse and flow straight into, after substance abuse, understanding the law and how to have a conversation with someone with respect to mental health issues, which will take us all of part 2. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kellie. There were some really great insights and specifics around mental health, which I think are really important for us all to be able to set up and have the conversation in part 2. There are quite a few questions coming through around how to have conversations, what kind of questions you can ask. So what I would say is please return for part 2, because it sounds like that's what Kellie's going to cover off on there, because we need to set the scene in order to be able to support with having those conversations. As I said, if you do have, at the beginning of the session, if you do have anything specific to your own unique situation, then please seek your own individual advice. But I want to take a moment to have a massive thank you to Kellie for sharing all of this wonderful knowledge and expertise with us. It was fantastic. There are a couple of resources on the website. You can sign up for webinar 2, which I believe is in 2 weeks' time, as well as find out more on the mental health project courses in the Employment Hero Learning Management System, which you can access, and all of your people should be able to access through Employment Hero. So thank you everyone for attending today. I hope you got some great information. You can see Kellie's details on the screen now as well if you want to get in contact. Like I said, remember that this is only session 1, and a lot of good information around having conversations will come in session 2. So Kellie, thank you so much for sharing, and thank you everyone for participating, and we'll see you next time.